The wind howled like a morning spirit through the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada, scattering snow in jagged, blinding flurries that turned the world into a swirl of white. It was minus 99 degrees Celsius, or so the thermometer in the town claimed, and in such merciless cold, even the hardiest of men would falter. Yet one solitary figure pressed on, his spurred boots crunching over ice, a tattered duster wrapped tightly around his broad shoulders, the collar pulled high against the gusts. He was a cowboy by necessity and solitude, a man whose face was carved from the mountains themselves, rugged, weathered, eyes storm gray, and haunted. His name was Silas McGraw, and in all the valley he owned nothing but his horse, his worn leather saddlebags, and a cabin perched on a hill where the wind left him raw and exposed to the world. Silas had long since abandoned hope of companionship. The small town of Red Hollow was a place of whispers and half-truths. People talked, yes, but not with hearts, only tongues sharpened by envy and cruelty. The neighbors who hadn't already cast him out regarded him with suspicion. Women whispered behind shawls. Men looked away from his gaze. Even the livestock that grazed in his sparse pastures, the skeletal cow he'd named Bessie, a goat he'd found wandering from the town pens, and 2 lambs so thin their bones pressed the wool to jagged angles, seemed to mirror his loneliness. Each day, he trudged through the snow to feed them, speaking little, thinking less, the cruelty of the world an ever-present frost upon his heart. That day, however, the wind carried a sound that broke the monotony of icy silence, muffled whimpers, a fragile chorus that could have been mistaken for the wind. But Silas's instincts, honed by years of survival, told him it was human. He followed the sound, stumbling over rocks and frozen roots, until he saw it. A wagon overturned in a shallow ravine, its wooden wheels jutting upward like broken bones. Beneath it, 7 small bodies were huddled together, shivering violently, their clothes little more than rags stitched together by desperation. Ages ranged from 3 to 12, and each one's eyes held the void of lives already burdened by grief and hunger. Silas didn't hesitate. He kicked snow off his boots, dropped to his knees, and wrapped his coat around the children. "Hold on," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "I won't let you go." They were orphaned, all of them. Red Hollow had not been kind. A fire had claimed the home of the oldest, a disease the second, and a cruel streak of town men had driven the rest into poverty and starvation when their parents were gone. Silas learned their names as he worked frantically to lift the wagon, just enough to free them. Clara 11, Eli 9, Maggie 7, Sammy 6, Tobias 5, Nina 4, and little Jack barely 3. Each child clung to a fragment of hope, each a whisper of lost family and stolen childhood. Even as he freed them, a harsh reality cut through Silas's heart. The children's bodies were gaunt, ribs pressing against thin shirts, cheeks hollow, lips purple with frostbite. They had been scavenging rotting scraps, frozen roots, and the occasional morsel from the livestock they had tended themselves. The goat bleated softly as if recognizing the desperation in their eyes. The lambs huddled close to Bessie, who mooed weakly, her own frame frail and hollow from hunger. Silas gathered them, one by one, draping them in his coat and wrapping them against the few blankets he had in his cabin. It was in that moment, as he carried the last child, that the cruelty of the townspeople revealed itself. On the ridge above, neighbors had gathered, not to help, but to watch their expressions, a mixture of mockery and disdain. Some shouted warnings. "Don't touch 'em, they're cursed. You'll freeze yourself trying to save their hide." Yet a single figure broke from the crowd, a woman named Agnes Whitaker, whose heart had never hardened to the suffering of others. She ran down the ridge, offering a pack of dry blankets she had kept hidden in her own home, and a small vial of whiskey for fevered lips. "Take them," she said, her eyes fierce yet tender. "No one deserves to die like this. Not them. Not you." Silas barely nodded, gratitude buried under exhaustion and cold. He placed the children near the cabin fire he had managed to keep burning against the storm's fury, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to feel a flicker of warmth, not just in body, but in spirit. Night fell, with a cruelty all its own. The wind screamed against the cabin walls, rattling the roof, But inside, Silas wrapped each child in blankets, whispered names, coaxed them to eat small portions of bread and dried meat. Little Jack whimpered, clutching his blanket like a talisman against the dark, while Clara tried to soothe her siblings with a courage she barely felt. Silas watched them, his eyes tracing the contours of faces scarred by loss and survival. He realized in a sudden, profound clarity that their arrival had altered the course of his solitude. Where once he had been a man alone against the harsh wilderness, now he bore the lives of 7 fragile souls upon his shoulders. Yet the world beyond his cabin remained cruel. Townsfolk came by the next morning, some sneering, some curious, each a reminder of the indifference and malice human hearts could harbor. One boy, Samuel Whitmore, dared taunt Tobias for his tattered jacket, prompting Silas to step outside and face the gathering. The cold bit his face, but his voice rang clear. "They're children. Leave them be, or you'll answer me." No one laughed. Fear and respect mingled in the air, and for once, the loneliness Silas carried was met with quiet acknowledgement. But as he returned to the cabin, he understood the battle had only begun. These children were not just orphaned, they were traumatized. Hunger and neglect had made them wary, even of him. Maggie flinched when he touched her shoulder. Eli clenched his fists when the goat nudged him. Nina cried quietly at the sound of Bessie's weak moo. Silas realized he had to earn their trust, not merely their survival. By the second day, he had organized the cabin, cleaned the livestock, and prepared small portions of food. The children began to respond, not all at once, but in tiny increments, a whispered, "Thank you," a hand placed lightly on his arm, a shivering smile. And yet, the cruelty of the town lingered like a shadow. Red Hollow was not ready to forgive, not yet. People still whispered that Silas had stolen the children, that he was a fool for risking his own life. But one thing was undeniable. In that cabin, amidst the howl of wind and the endless snow, life had taken root where only death had lingered before. That night, Silas sat by the fire with the children asleep, his gaze wandering to the skeletal cow and lambs in the snow-dusted pen. He murmured half to himself, half to the world, "We'll make it through, somehow." And for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to hope. The storm outside was relentless, but inside a fragile warmth, the warmth of trust, of connection, began to grow. And as the moon rose over the frozen peaks, silver and cold, Silas knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. Hunger, frost town cruelty, but also, perhaps, something he had long since given up believing in: family. Morning came like a blade, slicing through the frozen night with a pale, merciless light. Snow had fallen in fresh drifts, and the tracks of Silas's horse from yesterday were now buried, erasing the path of survival like a cruel trick. Inside the cabin, a faint smoke curled from the chimney, mingling with the scent of burnt wood and stale air. The children stirred, thin bodies shivering beneath threadbare blankets. Even under layers of clothing, their little frames were like fragile branches bending under the weight of the cold. Silas moved quietly among them, waking the older ones first. Clara's eyes flickered open, storm-gray and wary, yet a glimmer of trust had begun to shine there. "Good morning," he whispered, his voice hoarse from shouting against the wind. She blinked, hesitant, and then gave the tiniest nod. Maggie and Eli clung to her, like leaves to the same branch, seeking warmth from her presence. The day was not gentle. Outside, the wind tore through the hills with a deafening roar. The thin cow, Bessie, struggled to find even a scrap of grass beneath the thick crust of snow, while the goat and lambs huddled near the fence, trembling, their ribs visible through skin stretched too tight. Silas's hands were raw and cracked as he shoveled snow to clear the animal's pen and broke frozen branches for firewood. His muscles ached, his breath came in ragged bursts, but he did not falter. These children, these lives depended on him, and he had promised to protect them. But survival was never merely a matter of toil in the Wild West. It was a battle against the cruelty of men. Red Hollow's townsfolk had not forgotten Silas's defiance. Word had spread, twisted into a tale of a madman hoarding orphan children and starving livestock. That afternoon, a small group arrived at the cabin, not to help, but to intimidate. A burly man named Harris Calloway, his face ruddy from whiskey and spite, stepped forward with a sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero, McGraw," he barked. "Those kids belong to the town, not some loner living with ghosts and goats." Clara stood instinctively in front of the smaller children. "They're ours now," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. Silas placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "They're safe," he said quietly, but his heart thumped with anger. The townsfolk laughed, circling like predators. One threw a snowball at little Jack, who wailed in fright. Silas's jaw tightened. Yet amidst cruelty there were glimmers of kindness. Agnes Whitaker appeared again, her skirts dusted with snow, eyes sharp with determination. "Leave them alone," she called, her voice ringing clear. "They have no one but him. Don't shame yourselves by tormenting the innocent." Some townspeople grumbled, but Agnes's courage was a shield stronger than any blade. Silas, grateful yet wary, gave her a nod before returning to the children. The afternoon was spent repairing the cabin's roof, which had buckled under heavy snow, and feeding the children small portions of stew. Silas watched as Maggie tried to divide her meager serving with Tobias and Nina, her generosity touching him in a way words could not express. He realized that these children, though battered by life, had hearts braver than most adults he'd known. And in that realization, a seed of warmth began to root in his chest, a warmth reserved not for himself, but for those fragile lives entrusted him. Night brought deeper challenges. A blizzard howled outside, shaking the cabin with icy fists. The animals were restless, Bessie lowing weakly, the lambs bleating, the goat pacing nervously. The children, though wrapped in blankets, cried softly in their sleep, haunted by dreams of lost parents and starvation. Silas moved from one to another, stroking hair, whispering their names, recounting stories of better days he had never known himself. It was a strange ritual, a dance between hope and despair, and yet each moment forged a bond stronger than snow or wind. Then came the crisis. A portion of the roof gave way under the storm's weight, snow spilling into the cabin and chilling everyone to the bone. Silas's instincts kicked in, and he barked orders to the older children. Clara and Eli helped to gather the younger ones, while Silas grabbed a beam and braced the weakened roof. The snow crushed against him, soaking his coat and numbing his limbs, yet he held firm. Every second mattered. If the roof fell completely, they all would be buried together in the freezing chaos. Hours felt like days, but by morning the roof had been stabilized. Exhausted, Silas collapsed near the fire, his body racked with pain. He thought of his own past, of the loneliness that had once defined him, and realized that life now had a weight, a purpose he had never dared to imagine. The children stirred around him, their pale faces reflecting the first weak rays of sunlight. Even Bessie, the goat, and the lambs seemed to sense a reprieve, settling quietly in the snow-cleared pen. As the days passed, Silas taught the children how to care for the livestock and the small garden he had managed to protect beneath snow-covered soil. Clara learned to milk Bessie despite her frail strength. Maggie and Eli gathered firewood and tended to the goat, while Tobias, Nina, and little Jack learned to coax warmth from the lambs' trembling bodies. The children's laughter, though faint and brittle, began to echo against the mountains, filling the cabin with life Silas had not known since youth. Yet the cruelty of human hearts remained. Harris Calloway returned with 2 other men, threatening to report Silas to the sheriff for harboring stolen children. Silas met them at the cabin, his hand resting on the worn handle of his revolver, though he hoped he would never need it. "These children have no one but me," he said, voice steady, eyes hard. "I will not hand them over. Not to fear, not to cruelty. You may leave or face the consequences." The men laughed at first, but the raw determination in Silas's stance, combined with Agnes's unwavering presence at the cabin edge, gave pause. They left, muttering threats, yet in that moment, Silas felt the fragile shift of respect forming, not just from neighbors, but within himself. He had not only survived the storm, the cruelty, and the cold. He had stood for those who could not stand for themselves. It was during one quiet evening after the storm had passed that Silas truly felt the stirrings of something he had long abandoned. Love, not romantic perhaps, but a fierce and protective devotion. Clara, brushing snowflakes from a goat's fur, looked up at him with storm-gray eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "You saved us," she said simply. Silas felt a lump rise in his throat, and for the first time he allowed a fragile smile. "No," he said, "we saved each other." Even the animals seemed to sense the change. Bessie nuzzled Silas's hand as if to say, "We're in this together," and the lambs nestled close, finding warmth where only despair had lived before. The cabin, once a solitary refuge, now thrummed with life, laughter, whispers, small cries of hunger, and soft words of comfort. Silas knew there would be more battles, more cruelty from the outside, more frostbite, hunger, and death. But for now, there was survival, trust, and a family he had never thought to imagine. The moral of this chapter, the heart of the Wild West darkness, was clear. Even in the bitterest cold, amidst cruelty and death, kindness could ignite hope. Even a solitary man, hardened by life and grief, could find purpose in the lives of the smallest and weakest. And amidst snow, shattered roofs, and skeletal livestock, Silas McGraw discovered something more precious than any wealth: the capacity to love and protect, fiercely and without hesitation. The dawn broke soft and pale over the snow-covered hills, a fragile promise after days of blizzard and bitter cold. Silas McGraw stood at the cabin door, boots crunching against hardened snow, and watched the first light touch the peaks. The children were awake before him, their tiny breaths forming clouds in the frosty air, each one bundled in blankets, faces still pale, but alive, eyes glimmering with cautious hope. Even the animals, the skeletal cow, the shivering goat, and the lambs, moved slowly with renewed energy, drawn to life and warmth like all of them. It had been a long week since the wagon had fallen, a week of struggle against frostbite, hunger, and the harsh judgment of Red Hollow. Silas had learned the ways of survival, all over again, not alone, but as a guardian, teacher, and protector. Each day tested him in new ways, from shoring up the roof against collapsing snow to foraging enough food for 7 children and 4 thin animals. And every night, as the wind rattled the cabin walls, he sat near the fire and listened. Small sighs of comfort, soft whispers of trust, the faint, brittle laughter of children beginning to feel safe. Yet danger was never far. Harris Calloway had returned once more, emboldened by rumors and whispers, bringing with him a handful of townsmen who claimed he had authority, though authority in Red Hollow was nothing but a mask for cruelty. The men stomped through the snow toward Silas's cabin, shouts carrying over frozen fields. "Step aside, McGraw." Harris bellowed. "These children are of the town. You're nothing but a foolish loner." Silas stepped forward, hands steady on the handles of his tools. Behind him, Clara, Maggie, and Eli clung to each other, while the smaller children peeked from behind the cabin door, eyes wide but trusting. Agnes Whitaker stood just beyond the fence, her presence sharp and unwavering. "They are safe," she called. "Leave them alone, or you will be judged not by law, but by the lives you ruin with your cruelty." For a moment, the wind held its breath. The snow stilled. Silas could see fear flicker in the eyes of the men, but not enough to stop them entirely. One moved forward, brandishing a whip with reckless intent. In an instant, Silas acted, not with anger, but with measured authority. "Step back," he warned, voice calm yet immovable. He reached for his rifle, loaded long ago, but kept close for emergencies. The men froze. Silas did not raise the weapon, yet the weight of his determination, the raw authority of a man protecting those who could not protect themselves, was enough to halt them. Agnes stepped closer to him, hand resting lightly on his arm. "They will not harm us today," she whispered. Silas nodded, heart heavy with vigilance. In that silence, he realized that life's harshest trials often revealed its deepest rewards. These children had survived the cruelty of the world, and so had he. Together, they were stronger. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, a rhythm of life returned. Silas taught the children to tend the animals carefully. Bessie's ribs, once sharp under her thin coat, began to smooth as she grazed on newly cleared snow patches, fed grain and scraps with gentle persistence. The goat and lambs thrived in their pen, playful and trusting, as the children laughed while guiding them through the snow. Even little Jack, who had barely spoken since the wagon accident, began to mimic Silas's words, his tiny hands learning to feed and soothe the lambs. The children, too, began to open up about the past. Clara told stories of the fire that had stolen her family, of smoke and screams, of neighbors who had turned away when the world could have helped. Eli whispered of illness that claimed his mother, and of a father gone too soon, leaving him to wander the streets with hunger in his belly. Maggie spoke softly of cruel whispers from townsfolk who mocked the children's poverty, and Tobias and Nina shared frightened recollections of nights spent alone in frozen alleyways. Silas listened, never interrupting, never judging, only holding space for their grief. In each story, he felt a piece of the loneliness he himself had carried, mirrored back in these small, resilient lives. Then came the day of near tragedy. A blizzard struck suddenly, fierce and unrelenting, blanketing the hills in white chaos. Snow drifts piled high, blocking paths, collapsing weak fences, and threatening the livestock. Silas and the children worked feverishly to secure the animals, but a portion of the pen gave way. The goat darted into the snowbank, the lambs bleating in panic, Bessie stumbling. Clara screamed, tears freezing on her cheeks. Without hesitation, Silas plunged into the storm, limbs numbed by cold, heart thrumming with fear. He reached the animals, securing them one by one, dragging the goat and lifting the lambs into his coat. When he returned to the cabin, soaked and numb, the children rushed to him, hands clinging, voices trembling with gratitude. It was in that moment, amidst frostbitten fingers and frozen breaths, that Silas realized love, true, protective, and relentless, was no longer a concept, but a force shaping his life. He was no longer alone. These children, these fragile hearts, had become his reason to endure, to fight, to hope. Agnes joined them at the cabin, offering warmth and comfort, and together they formed a family not bound by blood, but by survival, trust, and care. Red Hollow slowly began to change as well. Word spread of Silas's courage, of his relentless protection of the children. Some townsfolk came cautiously, bringing small gifts of food, blankets, or advice, while others simply watched from a distance, curiosity replacing cruelty. Harris Calloway and his men never returned, their authority meaningless in the face of undeniable bravery and moral clarity. In time, the cabin transformed from a refuge into a home. A small garden bloomed beneath layers of snow, nurtured by Silas and the children. The animals, once skeletal and weak, grew strong, playful, and healthy. Clara and Maggie learned to milk Bessie, Eli and Tobias guided the lambs and goat, and Nina and little Jack ran in the snow, laughter echoing against the mountains like music long forgotten. Silas McGraw, once a man hardened by isolation, now found himself softened by the bond of love and responsibility. Agnes stayed, her heart intertwined with his, offering gentle guidance, shared laughter, and the warmth of companionship he had long abandoned. The nights, once filled with wind's fury and the ghost of loneliness, now held quiet conversations, soft stories by the fire, and the gentle breathing of those he protected. He taught the children the ways of the Wild West, the careful tending of animals, the skills to survive winter, the courage to face cruelty with integrity. And in turn, they taught him the resilience of hope, the innocence of laughter, and the unyielding strength of kindness. On the first anniversary of the wagon accident, Silas stood outside the cabin as snow fell gently, covering the earth in a soft white blanket. The children played nearby, the animals wandering freely, their ribs hidden beneath coats of warmth and care. Agnes stood beside him, her hand in his, eyes reflecting the pale light. Silas felt a profound sense of satisfaction. A life, once hollow and cold, now full of love, resilience, and purpose. He knew the world was still harsh and that cruelty could still lurk beyond the hills, but the lessons they had all learned were indelible. Survival depended not only on strength but on courage, kindness, and unwavering love. In saving the children, Silas had saved himself too. In nurturing the fragile, he had discovered the profound depth of humanity, the capacity for compassion, and the enduring power of family, not born of blood, but forged in shared struggle and unwavering devotion. And as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the snow-draped mountains, Silas McGraw whispered to the children gathered around the fire, "We endure. We protect. We love. That is what it means to live." And in that cabin, surrounded by laughter, warmth, and life reclaimed from the brink of death, the moral of their story shone brighter than any winter sun. Even in a world of cruelty and frost, kindness and courage could carve a place for hope, trust, and a family united against all odds. The story closes with a deeply fulfilling resolution. The children growing strong and joyful, Silas and Agnes united in trust and care, the animals thriving, and even the once harsh town touched by the quiet strength of compassion and courage. It's a tale where cruelty meets mercy, suspicion gives way to trust, and despair blossoms into hope.